Hello class, welcome to Supply and Demand Lesson 2. This lesson is on the determinants of supply and demand curves, but before we begin, let's make a quick review of Lesson 1. Does the change in a product's price move its demand curve? No, no, it doesn't. If you didn't get no for that question, go back and review Lesson 1. A change in a product's price only moves one along the demand curve. So I put this little graph down here to help you. So here's a demand curve. Now imagine we have a low price and then we let the price rise up here to P2. Some people who aren't careful or maybe aren't formally trained in economics will argue that, well, the price is higher, the demand curve has got to fall. But actually, no, the demand curve is all of the possible prices and the corresponding quantities demanded. So at this price down here at P1, I forgot about this arrow. Down here at price P1, the quantity demanded was here. When the price went up to P2, quantity demanded fell. So quantity demanded fell from here to here. That is true. When the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. But the demand curve itself stays the same because the demand curve is simply a list, a graphical representation of a list of all the possible prices that there might be and the corresponding quantities demanded. Okay, so that's what lesson 2 is about. It's about, well, if a price of a product doesn't move its demand or supply curve, then what does? And those things are called determinants. So let's start with the determinants of demand curves, or maybe a better way to put it would be things that cause the demand curve to move. So first we have change in income. Obviously, when income goes up, well, the demand curve is going to move. Most people will just say, hey, listen, if I have more income, my demand curve is going to increase. And for those situations, those goods are called normal goods. So normally we think our income goes up, we'll buy more of everything. But there's some things that we buy when we're trying to save money, and they're called inferior goods. I've always thought this was a terribly unfortunate designation for these goods. They're not really inferior in any sense of quality. They're just things that people buy when they're trying to save money, and when money's not a big issue, they choose not to buy those things anymore. So when I ask my students what are inferior goods, oftentimes they'll think of obvious things like ramen noodles or mac and cheese, but I bet there's plenty of you who really like mac and cheese and you would eat it even if you were as rich as Bill Gates. So all we can really say with confidence is that when income changes, the demand curve is going to move. Sometimes it will move out to the right when income increases. Those cases, that's called a normal good. Or if you got laid off your job, you'd buy less of that stuff. That would still be a normal good. And things that move inversely with changes in your income, those are called inferior goods. All right, next is change in the price of substitutes. And I have a separate slide for this because books only talk about obvious substitutes, and there's a whole nother dimension to this, and it's one of my pet peeves in textbooks that they don't spend any time talking about non-obvious substitutes. So I have a slide about that coming up in a minute. Then changes in the price of complements. Complements are two things that you use together. So like a substitute would be two things that you could use, one instead of the other, like hot dogs and hamburgers would be obvious substitutes. Hot dogs and hot dog buns would be obvious complements, things that you use together. And then obviously you might just change your mind about how much you like a thing, and that's all lumped into this box that we call changes in taste and preferences. It doesn't have to be as subtle as, well, I just don't like that thing anymore and now I like something else instead. It can be things that happen through time. I never really had an interest in hand cream or face cream when I was in my 20s, but now that I'm about to retire, those things are important to me, especially in the winter when the air is kind of dry. And we would lump all that kind of stuff into taste and preferences. Then there is changes in expectations. So what you think is going to happen in the future, especially the immediate future, will affect your decision to buy a thing today. If you think something's going to be more expensive in the future, you might run out and buy it today. On the other hand, if you think it's going to go on sale in the future, you might wait and buy it later when it goes on sale. Now, these are just the obvious determinants of demand curves. There are way more than that. This is just the short list. So there are other things. Um, One that probably most of you would argue should be on the short list would be like the weather, especially if the product that you're selling is something that has to do with being outdoors. So, for example, suppose you're selling umbrellas and you live in Utah where it doesn't rain much. The demand curve for umbrellas might be very small. But if you lived in Seattle where it rains all the time, the demand curve of that thing might be much higher. So obviously the weather is a determinant of demand curves. It just doesn't make the short list. And there's thousands of other things too. So what you're looking at is just the major ones. All right, now what about on the supply curve side, or things that move the supply curve? So there is changes in technology. As technology moves forward, it gets easier. We find new and better ways to make things. It causes the supply curves to shift out to the right. Then there's changes in the cost of inputs. So some of these are things that are obvious, like the cost of labor, the cost of raw materials, the cost of transportation, maybe marketing cost, these kinds of things that would be obvious. But it's also, I think it's a good idea to include in there the cost of taxes. Some books will list taxes as a separate determinant of supply curves, but from the manager's perspective, it's just another cost of doing business. So I usually include it here. Then there's changes in opportunity cost. This one's kind of tricky, and I have a separate slide for it. We'll come back to it in a minute. But opportunity cost is what you give up when you decide to do something, all those other things that you cannot do. So your opportunity cost, for example, of being in the graduate program in the College of Business is whatever it is you had to give up. Are you working fewer hours? Are you giving up family time? Are you giving up hobbies? Whatever it is that you're giving up, that's your opportunity cost of being in the graduate program. Anyway, I have another slide for that. We'll come back to it. Then, like on the determinants of demand curves, there's also changes in expectations on the supply curve side. So, for example, if you're a farmer and all your corn is in and it's in a big silo someplace, and you're thinking about bringing it to market, your decision to bring it to market or to hold it off the market for a few more weeks depends on what you think the price of corn is going to be in the future. If you think corn will be more expensive in the future and you got, 20 tons of corn in a silo someplace, or maybe 200 tons of it, you might wait a few weeks. Let's see, if it's higher in the future, you might wait a few weeks and sell it later when its price is higher. On the other hand, if you think corn is going to be cheaper in the future, you might rush to move your corn to market today. Again, this is just a short list. There are other things that can move a supply curve. These are just the ones that are normally listed in books. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at opportunity cost. Imagine this is a farm and we have 4 fields, and we have cotton in this field, soybean over here, tomatoes, and corn. And now let's imagine that something happens to the price of cotton, that cotton gets expensive, and everyone's expectation is that cotton is going to be expensive for several planting seasons. So what would this farmer do? I think all of you can probably see that this farmer would somehow try to increase the acreage that they have dedicated to cotton. That is, they would take acreage from soybean, tomatoes, and corn because there's more money in cotton. So if they did that, what exactly would happen in these 4 markets? Well, I hope you can see that the supply curve for cotton isn't going to move. All that's going to happen is the price of cotton is going to go up. And when it does, the quantity supplied of cotton is going to move from here out to here. The supply curve for cotton hasn't moved because it is, after all, a schedule of all the possible prices of cotton and the corresponding quantities supplied. But down here, things are very different. The supply curve for corn is going to shift back to the left. So for any price of corn, there's going to be less corn supplied than before, because some of the acreage that used to go into the production of corn has now been moved into the production of cotton. We'll have similar decreases in the market for soybean and tomatoes, and really for any other farm product that's acreage could be given over to cotton. All right, now let's take a closer look at substitutes. This is one of my favorite topics. Textbooks, usually when they give examples of substitutes, they give something like this, like hamburgers or chicken, because these are two things that you might have for lunch. In fact, they're my two favorite things to have for lunch. These are obvious substitutes. I can have a hamburger or I can have a chicken sandwich. But what about a raincoat and an umbrella? These things are very different. This thing's got metal in it. It's long. Raincoat is like, something you can fold up or hang in your closet, but they perform the same function. So would you call these substitutes? I think 99% of the people would agree that those things are substitutes, but they're not quite the same as hamburgers and chicken, two things that you can put in your mouth. Now, what about shoes and sandals? These are two things you can wear on your feet, but they're not really substitutes all the time, because things that are appropriate for sandals are not always the same as things that are appropriate for shoes. So there'd be some situations where sandals don't seem like a good idea, but there'd be other situations where you could choose one or the other. So now we're drifting slowly away from obvious substitutes. What about pizza dinner and a movie? One of my favorite examples. If you're really hungry, then a movie is not going to satisfy you. So if you're really hungry, a pizza dinner and a movie aren't substitutes. But on the other hand, what if you're just trying to think of something to do on Friday night with that special someone? And you might say, well, let's go get a pizza dinner or let's go to a movie. In this case, these things are substitutes, even though they are very different things. What about aluminum and steel? Well, surely you can think of many applications where these things are not substitutes. But again, there are many applications where they are substitutes. So aluminum and steel, even though, well, they're both metals, but one is much stronger than the other. One is lightweight, one is heavy, and so forth. One rusts and one doesn't. But there are many applications where these things are substitutes and others where they are not. What about jewelry and a sweater? Oh my gosh, how could they ever be substitutes? Well, if you're just trying to find a gift, like you want to buy a gift for that special someone, you might think, well, I'm going to go someplace to a jewelry store and I'm going to buy a piece of jewelry. But on your way, maybe you pass by a retail clothing store, if there are any still open, and you see a really nice sweater and maybe it's on sale. So jewelry and a sweater can be substitutes if you're looking for a gift, but they're not substitutes if it's freezing cold outside. Or if you're looking for an engagement ring, a sweater is just not going to do it. But there are certain situations where they would be substitutes. What about a boat and a car? Now, I know I've gone on a long time with this, but think about this a second. When I ask my undergraduate students, they know the answer has to be that, yeah, they can be substitutes. And so they will struggle to find why that might be. And they'll say things like, well, a boat is a substitute for a car if you live in Venice, or maybe if you live in the Louisiana Bayou. No, that's not what I mean. If you live in Somerville, can a boat be a substitute for a car? Yes, it can. So what happens in this example is most people, when I put this question to them, they think about how desperate you would be for a car if you didn't have a car. Well, if you don't have a car, your car got totaled yesterday, and by the grace of God, you're okay and you just need a new car, then no, a boat is not a substitute for a car. But the vast majority of people who are looking for a car today aren't in that desperate situation. The vast majority of people who are looking for a car today already have a car. In fact, they probably drove their car to the auto dealer's lot to look at a new car. And for those people, they're looking for like a newer car, a fancier car, a more fuel-efficient car, a more reliable car, a faster car, who knows what. But they're looking for something slightly different than what they have. So for those people, while they're trying to decide whether they're going to throw down all this money on an expensive car, they might think, well, gee, I could just live with the car I have, get it repaired, get it detailed, or do something, and take the money I save and buy something else, like a boat. like a boat. You might say, well, sweetheart, we can go and buy a new car, but we could instead just keep the car we have and get a boat or whatever. All right, so what about a Disney vacation versus braces for your child? I hope all of you can see now that my position on substitutes are that anything, sorry, that came up, I don't know what it is, anything that competes for the consumer's dollar are essentially substitutes. So maybe you're planning a Disney vacation for your family this summer, and then you discover that your child needs braces. You might decide, well, I'm going to put off my Disney vacation so I can finance the braces for my child. And if you decide that, then braces for your child in a Disney vacation are substitutes. The best way to think of this is like whether a thing is an obvious or non-obvious substitute can be put on a scale. These are obvious ones, and these are not obvious, but that does not mean that they are not substitutes. They are substitutes. This is important, especially if you own your own business or if you're in the marketing department. You're always struggling to figure out who your competitors are. And don't imagine for a second that your competitor is just somebody that's making the same product that you're making. Your competitors can be very, very different. Now I have one more of these. Sorry, I'm going to beat this to death just a little bit. But let's look at one more non-obvious substitute. This summer, I was up in upstate New York, and I went to the Corning Glassworks Museum. I didn't think I would find an example for this class, but I did. Can glass be a substitute for copper? Well, it seems obviously no. Of course it can't. But I came upon this display at the Corning Glassworks Museum, and this is bundles of copper cable. And this display is about the bandwidth that's able to pass through fiber optics. So this looks like a photo that I've taken a photo of, but it's not. So I went over to the side of this thing. It's in 3 dimensions. I went over to the side of it and I took another picture. And here it is. Oh, yeah. So now each of those little round discs in that other photo represents these. God, there must be 1,000 wires in this and another 1,000 over here. That's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Who knows how many wires this is. So now let's back up. Where'd it go? Okay, so this little glass fiber transmits the same amount of information as all of these copper cables. So here it is a little closer. This little glass fiber can do the same work. If you're talking about building a network, an internet, then this little glass fiber can do all the work of all those copper cables. So now the question again, can glass be substitute for copper? Well, not if you're trying to stamp out pennies, but if you're trying to build an internet or you're trying to communicate in long distances, oh my gosh, yes it can. And do you think that the technological innovation of fiber optics has caused something to happen to the market for copper? Of course it has. They are substitutes. All right, so I beat that to death, but it's important that you remember that substitutes are everywhere. Just open your eyes and you will see them everywhere. All right, what's next? All right, so how does a demand curve move or shift? Well, this is an increase in a demand curve, and I've never seen a student who couldn't immediately identify that as an increase. But the problem is that students have a tendency to think of this as moving up and down. So they think of this as an increase, and if you put a demand curve down here, they would think of it as a decrease. It's not really wrong to do it that way, but it's dangerous, and I recommend against it. It's much better to think of an increase in the demand curve as a shift out to the right, and a decrease in the demand curve would be a shift back here to the left. Much safer to think of it that way, and here's why. If you try to do the same thing with a supply curve, okay, so here's the supply curve. Now let's show an increase in the supply curve. Here it is out here. But now if you're thinking of these things as movements up and down, this would be down, right? But that is an increase in the supply curve, not a decrease. So if you think of these things as up and down, you're going to get mixed up. It's much, much better to think of them always as left and right shifts. So a right shift in the supply curve is an increase, just like a rightward shift in the demand curve was an increase. A leftward shift would be decreases, and so forth. Okay, so that's it for lesson 2. The next lesson is on finding equilibrium with supply and demand, sometimes called comparative statics. And this comes to us from Alfred Marshall, who is really the founder of, well, I don't know, some people would disagree, but I would call him the founder of modern economics because Alfred Marshall is the guy that put all this math into econ. He really invented supply and demand curves. In fact, when you go to grad school in econ, these are called Marshallian demand curves, what I've been showing you. There was another guy, more obscure. His name was Raz, and he also invented demand curves, but they were slightly different. I don't know of anybody that uses Walrasian demand curves. We all use these Marshallian demand and supply curves, and that's coming up in the next lesson. Okay, that's it.